All right, welcome everybody to How Culture Promotes Safety and Violence Prevention. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land in which we're hosting this webinar today, and pay my respects to the elders of past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge all other traditional custodians from the lands in which those listening are listening in today. So just a couple quick housekeeping items before we get started. We'd love to hear from your questions, so we strongly encourage you to send them through on the chat tab on the right-hand side at the bottom of the presentation. If you have more than one person in the room listening today over the webinar, can you please send us a quick message via the chat tab to let us know how many people are listening? And at the end of our presentation, once the webinar ends, a short survey will go out and appear. So if you could please give us some feedback from today's event, we'd really appreciate it. So before we get into the presentations, I want to tell you a little bit about Injury Matters. Injury Matters is for safer people and places. And our purpose is to prevent and reduce the impact of injury within the West Australian community. We do this through advocacy and education for injury prevention and supporting those impacted by injury across the state. So one of the programs we have is the No Injury program, and this is what's providing the webinar today. So through No Injury, we provide information and resources, training, and then networking opportunities for people interested in injury prevention. So I want to acknowledge that today we're discussing a distressing topic. I also would like to pay respects to those that have been impacted by family and domestic violence, either through lived experience or have lost someone close to them through an act of violence. The seriousness of family and domestic violence can drastically impact on one's health and well-being. If you are concerned about your safety or someone you know, please call one of these helplines. I want to also talk to some of the eye-opening statistics on violence. Violence against women is a widespread problem in Australia. However, what we do know in Australia, 1 in 6 women and 1 in 16 men has experienced at least one incidence of violence by a partner. And hospitalization rates for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women due to family violence-related assaults are 32 times the rate of non-Indigenous women. In WA in 2018, there were 37 homicides related to family and domestic violence, and 61% of assault victims were victims of family and domestic violence. So due to the individual and structural factors that influence violence, including social norms and gendered drivers and colonization, which we will all be addressing today, we need prevention strategies to address systematic change. So today we'll be discussing these topics. So I'm going to, before I hand it over to Daphne and Monica from Desert Blue Connect, I'd like to just introduce them. Daphne is the Executive Manager of Operations at Desert Blue Connect and has worked in women's health promotion and family violence practice for the past 10 years in Geraldton. She has a bachelor's in health promotion and a postgraduate diploma in domestic and family violence practice. Daphne has a passion for women's health and interests in family violence prevention and response. In her role at Desert Blue Connect, Daphne co-founded the Geraldton community-based primary prevention project called Community, Respect, and Equality. The project is a first of its kind in regional Australia, based on the evidence-based Change the Story framework, which we'll touch base on later today. Daphne continues to research, innovate, and lead women's health promotion and family and sexual violence prevention in the WA Midwest. I'd also like to introduce Monica. Monica is the Community Initiatives Coordinator at Desert Blue Connect and has a Master's of Public Health and Health Promotion with an emphasis on women's sexual and reproductive health. She is passionate about research and programs that impact the social determinants of health to improve health equity worldwide. So just bear with me for 1 second. We're going to take it and hand it over to Daphne and Monica.
Okay.
Muted.
Everyone, it's Daphne here. I'm just checking that everyone can hear. Okay, looks like we're good to go. Yep. Okay, so I'm here today with Monica. So do you want to say hi, Monica?
Hello, good to see you all, or not see you all.
Yes, so welcome everyone. Our presentation today will cover the problem of family violence and provide an overview of our primary prevention project here in Geraldton, the Community Respect and Equality Initiative. Just to make it easier when I'm talking, I'm just going to refer to the CRE throughout this presentation rather than the full Community Respect and Equality. Monica will cover the Change the Story theory, which has formed this initiative. She'll go through the 4 gender drivers and provide some examples in more detail a bit later. So then I will cover at the end how we're changing the story in Geraldton and go over our CRE actions so far. So I'll just focus on our current main project, the CRE agreement, and just go over that and how that's been structured and how businesses can commit. So please save your questions for the end and we'll try and answer them as well. Thanks, Monica. Okay. So I'll start with why we felt a need to prevent family violence in our community. We all are well informed that the problem of family violence is a big one in Australia. So I won't go through the statistics because they were up on the screen earlier. But why does this matter for Geraldton? So we did have some, or still have some high local statistics. So our Midwest region averages between 200 and 220 reported family violence incidents a week to police. When you consider that only 20 to 25% of incidents are actually reported, the number is likely to be much, much higher. So response services such as Desert Blue Connect are often overburdened. So imagine all the police, hospital and agency resources that would be free to do other important things if we actually stopped family violence. We all deserve to feel safe no matter what. So all our work at the CRE is based with a human rights framework. And we understand that family violence takes these rights away from people. So our CRE overall project, it came about in 2017. So it was originally funded with a Department of Social Services grant, and we developed a local strategic plan to prevent family violence in Geraldton. Along the way, we sourced other funding, such as WA Police Community Crime Prevention Grants, and Bendigo Bank has also helped us out. And they've enabled us to do other actions in the plan. So our plan has a primary prevention focus. So this means we want to stop violence before it starts. It was community consulted and developed. And we do have a reference group that is still with us from the initial start who provide strategic direction. It was developed using our Watch framework and in particular the Change the Story, which Monica will talk about more later. First plan of its kind in Australia, built with the community, launched in September 2017 by Minister McGuirk, who is our Minister for Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence here in Western Australia. So Desert Blue Connect project managed the CRE, and we work in collaboration with the CRE reference group, who still provides leadership with our project. This slide just shows the different rates of violence against men and women. So it's very important to understand it does look different for women and men. So it does affect us in different ways. So it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, it does affect individuals and also our community. So I won't go through them all, but I'll just highlight the top one. 1 in 5 Australian women have experienced sexual violence compared to 1 in 22 Australian men. If you look further down, you'll see it's a higher percentage of women to men on most of those statistics. The main takeaway here I want everyone to understand is that family violence affects both men and women, but over 90% of those who use violence are male. And those men who suffer violence often suffer at the hands of men. So men who have the violence, it's initiated by other men. So to say that family violence is a very gendered issue. Women experience more likelihood of severe injury, fear and death from family violence than men. This is why we look at family violence through a gendered lens, and also what most people know as the feminist framework. So I'm going to hand over to Monica now. She'll go through the theory.
So as you've already heard, the theory is based on the Change the Story framework, a national framework for the prevention of violence against women that was produced in 2015 by Our Watch, Anne Rose, and Vic Health. Given that we're lucky enough to have someone from Our Watch here today, I'll let them tell you a little bit more about what they do, but suffice it to say that the framework aims to prevent violence against women by changing the social context and fighting for gender equality. I'd also like to take a moment to point out a difference between the Change the Story framework and the CRE project. And that is that in the CRE project, we're talking about family violence, not violence against women. Family violence was chosen as the term for the CRE because it encompasses a wider range of violence experienced in our community and is the preferred term of the Aboriginal community in Geraldton. Family violence does include violence against women in the form of intimate partner violence and domestic violence, but not all violence against women is family violence. For example, sexual harassment is often not family violence. Family violence also includes things like elder abuse and situational couple violence, which is not necessarily violence against women, though it can be based on the gender of the victim. I find it helpful to think about family violence and violence against women as a Venn diagram, and that the CRE works in the overlapping space between the two. So we'll briefly touch on what we mean by primary prevention, though I expect a fair few of you are familiar with this framework, and that the CRE project is functioning at the primary prevention level, which means we target the whole of population to prevent violence from occurring in the first place. So you can see the main difference is that in tertiary prevention or response, violence has already occurred, and we aim to prevent the reoccurrence. In secondary and primary, violence has not yet occurred, but the audience is different. Secondary is targeted, aimed at groups with higher than average risk. We're functioning in the primary prevention stage. Okay. Sorry, just a minute, my slide is deciding not to cooperate. There we go. So, at its heart, family violence is about power and control, and using your power over another person. As violence against women is driven by gender inequality and the resultant power imbalance, to fight family violence, we must fight inequality in all its forms. This includes the 4 drivers of family violence as conceptualized by the Change the Story framework. You can see these drivers here. Attitudes that condone violence against women, men's control of decision-making, and limits to women's independence. Stereotyped constructions of masculinity and femininity, or rigid gender roles. Disrespect towards women, and male peer relations that emphasize aggression. However, it must be noted that this simplistic understanding of gender inequality as the cause of family violence does not describe the whole picture of violence experienced by marginalized women, such as women with disabilities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, which is why Change the Picture, the framework that we're very excited to hear about later, was created. This is necessary because people who experience multiple forms of oppression, such as Aboriginal women who experience both sexism and racism, often suffer from a higher burden of violence due to these intersecting marginalities, such as that statistic we heard earlier, with the 32 times more likely to be hospitalized. This is because when it comes to forms of oppression, 1 + 1 does not equal 2. Instead, they multiply to create a situation where the violence experienced is both more frequent and more severe. The CRE agreement, while remaining a primary prevention plan that does not target a specific at-risk group, acknowledges this heightened risk of violence for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and works to be explicitly anti-racist and to fight racism in all of its forms. It also must be noted that the CRE's understanding of family violence was based on the coercive control model of family violence, which has been critiqued for its lack of nuance in understanding different typologies of violence. In coercive control, one partner uses an act or a pattern of acts of assaults, threats, humiliation, and intimidation or other abuses to harm, punish, or frighten the victim. Coercive control is a strongly gendered type of violence, with women being the predominant victims and men the main users of this type of violence. However, the new model you see here from Heather Nana Caro's new book, Unintended Consequences of Domestic Violence Law, reconceptualizes the typologies of violence seen in the community and is especially relevant to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities as it widens the understanding of different types of violence, such as understanding the difference between violent resistance, coercive control, or situational couple violence, which would fit in chaos context violence. For example, coercive control is when a woman is constantly stalked, monitored, and isolated by their male partner. They may also have their finances restricted or have constant belittling and verbal abuse so that the woman does what the man wants. As opposed to situational couple violence, where both partners cannot manage their emotions and fly off the handle. This can be circumstantial, for example, conflict over children or alcohol and drug related. This is a big difference between the understanding of coercive control, which is not caused by alcohol and drug, which we will discuss later. However, in situational couple violence, there's no control and power displayed from either party. Thus, the conceptualizations that we have around it are not appropriate to use when discussing situational couple violence versus coercive control. So for the remainder of this presentation, we will be discussing coercive control type violence. So how does gender inequality cause coercive control type family violence? The way that the CRE, and Change the Story, conceptualizes this is that gender inequality creates the necessary social context for violence against women to occur. This means that all the drivers that I spoke about previously feed the idea that women are the possessions of men, which creates a world in which men's violence against women is acceptable and the norm. The first driver, attitudes that condone violence against women, is pretty easy to understand. It's things like the quotes on these posters from the line, "She was asking for it. He did it because he likes you." Well, that's just boys being boys. All of these quotes excuse and minimize violence. You could think of these attitudes as the more overtly sexist comments. Moving on to driver number 2, men's control of decision-making and limits to women's independence. We're getting into the structural roots of sexism, the things that work together to create a world in which women are financially second-class citizens, something that enables things like financial abuse, or may simply be a barrier in and of itself to a woman leaving a violent relationship, because without the man as the primary breadwinner, she does not have enough money to safely leave. Consider that women in Australia earn on average $240 less per week than men. This adds up over time to less savings, less super, and often less time in the workforce due to time off for childcare duties. And unfortunately, in our home state, WA, we have the worst wage gap in the country, with men earning 23.1% more than women. Victoria, on the other hand, is leading the way, as usual, with a wage gap down to 9.3%. If you're still skeptical about how men control decision-making, think about gender inequality in places like Parliament or CEOs. For example, out of the 400 ASX-listed companies, only 23 of those CEOs are women. In comparison, there are more men named Peter, 26 mind you, who are CEOs of ASX-listed companies than there are all women CEOs combined. This matters because it perpetuates the gender inequality that drives the power imbalances that allow men to exert their power over women and feed the coercive control typology of violence. So now that we've discussed the more explicitly sexist attitudes and the structures that enable gender equality, we're moving on to the third driver, rigid gender roles and stereotyped constructions of masculinity and femininity. Now this is a big one, but the important point here is that it's not the gender roles in and of themselves that are harmful, but it is the rigid adherence and policing of these gender roles that causes the negative cultural context that we create, especially when women occupy a lesser role in the gender binary of roles, if it's hierarchical. Now I'm just going to play a quick video that helps us to better understand and see a lot of the gender roles that we are unconsciously policing or creating. Please comment if you can't hear this. I think the sound should work though. So just bear with me. There we go.
Not only are girls seen as objects by other people, they learn to see themselves as objects.
There's still so much work that has to happen with girls about identity and about the emphasis placed on beauty and bodies. But for boys, there's been no similar kinds of movement at all. Boys are still led to believe that power is associated with domination. We need to redefine strength in men, not as the power over other people, but as forces for justice. And justice means equality, fairness, and working against poverty, and working against, inequality and violence. That's strength.
We're creating new leaders, and they're going to not look like how they always did. That is the true reflection of this country and of this world.
So I like to think about this as thinking of us growing up in a society of rigid gender roles as fish in water. The fish have only ever lived in water, so they can't see the water until they're taken out of it. In this way, if we've only ever known one way of being in regards to gender roles, it can be very hard for us to even acknowledge their existence. The first step in decreasing the rigidity of these roles is acknowledging the resistance. And you'll see a little bit of that unconscious bias coming out in this video, the commercial by Respect Victoria.
It's okay. He's just being a boy. Don't worry, Mum. I know it's okay for boys to push girls.
Yeah, and when I grow up, I guess it'll be okay if I'm violent with them.
Sorry, that's not what I meant.
So just like the woman in this video, we often don't know what we're saying. We don't think about it. Just like with rigid gender roles, the key here is to get people to think about what we're saying and doing and how it affects others and the culture we are raising the next generation in. Okay. So with the drivers of family violence, I'll talk about this really quickly. There are other aspects, the reinforcing factors of family violence, such as you see number 5 through 9 on the screen here. Things like drug and alcohol, experience and exposure to violence, and backlash factors, that we do not think about these as causal, because without them, the violence still exists. However, with them, the violence is often worse and more frequent. I like to think about it as throwing acid on a fire. The reinforcing factors are the acid. It'll make it much worse, but it didn't start the fire. And you can ask more about that at the end as we're getting a little short on time. So we'll probably skip this video until the end, but I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Daphne to talk about how we're changing the story in Geraldton.
Thanks, Monica. Just to summarise, the following slides quickly outline how we're working to change the story here in Geraldton. So we did hold a summit in 2017. It was a day of inspiring speakers and education on what we all can do to prevent family violence. We also had a community champions project. You can see the champions here with their messaging. This is finished now, but it was a great little initiative. We still have the reference group, which I mentioned before, and our most recent project is the CRE agreement for businesses and organisations, which was launched earlier this year. So I'll just quickly chat about that. What is a CRE agreement? So it's for organisations and businesses in Geraldton to collectively say that violence is never okay in our community. So any organisation or business can be involved. It's community-wide, community-owned, and it is a primary prevention of family violence initiative. So we're looking at stopping family violence before it starts. We have 23 organisations signed up at the moment. There's their logos there, and it's a bit of a mix there. So, for example, we have the Ports Authority, who are the first business to sign up, and they've been extremely engaged and proactive about promoting equality and respect in their workplace here. When you sign up, you commit to these agreed values, the community collaboration, respect and cultural diversity, equality, safety and social justice. So everyone signs up and they make changes in their workplace to make sure that these agreed values are upheld. And they also go through accreditation. So there's actions that each business or workplace needs to do. So next slide, Monica. Yep. So the second part of the sign up for the agreement is that the workplace commits to achieving level 1. Level 1 is a basic introduction awareness of family violence in the workplace. We ask that 7 items are completed for accreditation, but businesses are quite welcome to do all of them and then additional ones as they see fit. Ways to achieve level 1, for example, are promote the CR agreement through posters, family violence brochures, etc. in their workplace, waiting rooms. Raise internal awareness by including the agreed values and codes of behaviours in induction packages. Businesses can engage with the community by participating in our CRE week or attending family violence prevention events. Whatever works for the organisation. Just some examples here are again the Ports Authority. They're actually doing the awareness raising for the 16 days of prevention of violence against women shortly. The Sports House has linked the CRE into the True Sport program. We've had a CRE community breakfast with 5 key partners. And Western Australian Centre for Rural Health has done internal and external awareness raising through a new resource with stories about family violence from their workplace called Making the Invisible Visible, and that was just launched last week. So that's all we have here, and we'll wait to the end for any questions.
Okay, so I'll just pass the screen back over to you guys. Just a minute.
Unmuted.
All right, great. Thank you, Daphne and Monica. That was fantastic. We'll hold questions till the end for now. And
Sounds good.
we'll hold questions for now. And thank you. All right, so now I'm going to change it over to Brooke O'Donnell. Brooke O'Donnell was a member of the advisory group that oversaw and contributed to the development of Changing the Picture. Brooke currently works for the WA Department of Justice as an Aboriginal Senior Programs Officer. In this role, she offers counseling for Aboriginal men and family domestic violence treatment programs and women in cognitive-based therapy programs. Brooke is also completing a Master's of Social Work placement at Indigo Junction, where she works with young people who are at risk of or experiencing homelessness and to build their self-determination and skills to live independently. Brooke is a local government counselor for the city of Kalamunda. Brooke's family are Bulgu, coming from the Yandiyara in the Pilbara region, or Yumanji as a larger clan. I'm going to pass it over to Brooke here.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. So I'm going to talk to you about the changing the picture. So we've got a couple of topics that we're going to talk about. The development with regards to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women's experiences of violence, what drive violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and what actions we can take. And I apologise if some of the stuff does overlap. I'll try not to focus too much on what we've already covered. So changing the picture was actually a result that came out of Change the Story consultations. Now, Change the Story is obviously the initial framework for the primary prevention of violence against women and their children. Change the Story is based on international and national evidence on what drives violence against women and how it can be prevented. Change the Story is the shared national framework to guide all individuals and organisations against Australia to be on the same page to prevent violence against women, and all governments are committed to implementing the third action plan. So obviously with respect to Change the Story, although it is a national framework that's designed to be relevant across the whole of Australia population, obviously, you know, we're so many thousands of different community groups and everything is so sparse and very different to different communities. So we acknowledge that it can't necessarily do justice to the specific and complex issue of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So it would need to have, you know, much further consideration of how to effectively prevent violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and their children. It's imperative, and that would require a separate dedicated effort that's guided by a participatory process where the voices, experiences, ideas and solutions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people themselves are central to those discussions. So just something to bear in mind. So the development process, it was actually an advisory group of 11 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women that was actually via a public expression of interest process, and you can see me at the very bottom there, looking all fancy. What occurred was an extensive literature review which prioritised publications by Indigenous authors and organisations, and then there was a first round of open consultations with various community groups and agencies and people across the country. Obviously, again, resources very small on the side. So as much as our watch can get across the whole entire country, as much as could be done was completed, and then completed a draft in consultation with our advisory group. And then we had a second round of consultation to get feedback on the draft, and then there was a formal review by 7 Indigenous academics and practitioners and ANROs. So it was quite an exhaustive process, and it did actually continue further on than what initially was going to be expected. But I guess the point of that is that we want to make sure that this is a document that we get right and that everybody's across it and agrees. And obviously it's a really important document that we're going to use going forward. So talking about statistics with violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and children, it's disproportionate and rare, 3.1 times the rate. National surveys, we're talking about experiencing violence in the previous 12 months, 3.1 times the rate of non-Aboriginal women. And again, as previous persons spoke of, everything is very underreported. So just imagine what the rates really are like if we actually had the right surveys, the right information. 3 in 5 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women have experienced physical or sexual violence perpetrated by a male intimate partner, and 11 times more likely to die due to assault than non-Indigenous women. So there are some real serious and real barriers to reporting that information. So we're talking about the issue and misconceptions that we identified as part of changing the picture. So violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander is a national problem, and it requires a national solution. And violence is not part of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, and where I work obviously in the prison system, is very much a common theme when I work with Aboriginal men, that violence is part of the culture. Violence was my way, and obviously we work with to dispel those myths that it is not part of our culture and it's not accepted, and is very much not part of our way, literally not our way program. Violence is perpetrated by men of all cultural backgrounds, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and in diverse settings and geographical contexts. Obviously, Aboriginal women and their children is the focus of violence, but we acknowledge that not every Aboriginal men are highlighted as people who commit violence against Aboriginal women or women and children, and people don't acknowledge the fact that we have mixed relationships. We don't all have relationships with people in our own community groups. So that's something important to bear in mind. And also, so violence is perpetrated by men of all cultural backgrounds. We talked about how serious and the real barriers to reporting the information. And as was identified before, alcohol is a contributing factor and can be a trigger for violence, but it's not the cause of the violence. And again, that's alcohol, drugs, those sorts of things are things that, again, within my community counselling programs, we work with that. So we're going to talk about drivers of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So we've got there a little diagram. We talk about the drivers of violence with the ongoing impacts of colonisation for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander women. We talk about the ongoing impacts of colonisation for non-Indigenous people in society, and we also talk about the gendered factors, and the intersection between those drivers actually results in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women experiencing disproportionate levels of violence and severe and complex impacts that come out of that. So when we talk about the first slide that we're referring to, the intergenerational and collective trauma, now experience unique forms of trauma and post-traumatic stress as a result of the ongoing and cumulative effects of colonisation, loss of land, language and culture, the erosion of cultural and spiritual identity, the forced removal of children, and racism and discrimination. So it's transferred and transmitted from one generation to the next. And again, as we talked about, the Not Our Way program, something that we do in this local community about trying to acknowledge and build upon understanding this intergenerational and collective trauma. Men are using physical strength against women, which is wrong. But obviously the research and data shows that the issues that the men have, and they're unable to deal with them, and that's where the violence can arise from in any way, shape or form. So colonisation, disempowering men, and that intergenerational trauma has been handed on or, just taken, from role modelling and all that sort of thing. But so we need to understand that, and we need to recognise that, but not allow that to happen or be an excuse for violence in any way. And that was Craig Rigney that said that. So it's really important to, acknowledge that what's occurred, in past history and still continues today, but in no way or shape or form does that mean that it's acceptable. But we can only move forward if we accept where some of the issues have come about. We talk about systemic oppression, disempowerment, racism. Colonisation is a system of oppression that has created structural institutional inequalities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we've got racist violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's a major role in Australian history, and it persists in many different forms today. We've got violence perpetrated against individuals in public places. We've got attacks on communities or neighbourhood violence or, family feuding. The actions of racist organisations and violence perpetrated by state agencies such as police and the criminal justice system. And obviously that's not a good thing to say when you obviously work for the agencies, but, you have to acknowledge the, what you see in the media. Not all of that is positive in regards to trying to, change the systemic oppression and to change what's going on. when we talk about, the cultural knowledge and practices that previously existed when we talk about our people's roles and, our obligations and the way that we relate to each other, that all of that has been significantly destroyed from colonisation. So it's not necessarily that stuff needs to be rebuilt. And again, talking from, like Indigo Junction, where I work with the young people who are often in the care of child protection and family services. We have a strong fathers program that builds upon cultural knowledge and, connection to country and practices, taking people out to country and, camping and building that understanding so that even when these men become fathers, that hopefully the, like I said, the trauma, the oppression, all of the issues will be, minimised and healing. And also within the prison system, we use elders to build on traditional culture as a way of improving, again, the system with healing and to try and promote identity and building one's culture. And, I guess the final part is recognising that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they're more likely, or we are more likely to have personal experiences of violence and exposure to multiple forms of violence than the general population. So, we've got colonial violence, we've got racist violence, we've got interpersonal and institutional violence, if we've got family violence, and then community violence that are all characteristics of oppressed and traumatised communities. So just recognising how complex, all of the interlades can be. We talk about high rates of incarceration. Obviously, that would be reminiscent of me not to mention young people, men and women. Obviously, young people, Indigenous people own such a high proportion of custody in Australia, and WA is sadly probably one of the highest of all. And as you can read there, many of the young people in detention centres are Aboriginal. I think the rate's something around 85, 87% in WA. Again, the highest. And the youngest, says there, it's 10 years old and, being a child locked up. And as the person said, with what has been happening in the past few years with the Northern Territory, the abuse in juvenile detention centres, when they're released, a person is released, they get a partner and this cycle continues. So going into custody actually makes things significantly worse. And unfortunately, that's not, that's not the intent. And, our young people being put into detention centres and, women and men incarcerated, and the effect that has on the family systems, it's further disrupted with our family and our cultural relationships, and the effect that psychological damage has upon that family or that community, that it's very sad. But yeah, the current response to violence is relying on the criminal justice system and, punitive approaches. And we know that, most men will be imprisoned or, given a community order or something like that. And that's where the traumatic impact compounds on already the underlying issues which haven't been resolved. And a lot of that is not getting resolved in the criminal justice system. So the intergenerational trauma, the institutional abuse, dispossession of land and culture. So family violence is a cause, but it's also a consequence of imprisonment. So just recognising how, like we said, the revolving door, it continues. So we talked about ongoing impacts of colonisation for non-Indigenous people and society. And, we talked about race, we talked about structural inequalities of power, racism in social norms, attitudes and practices. We talk about perpetrating racist violence and also condoning and insufficient accountability for violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And again, you only have to look at the newspapers to see when, you're comparing non-Aboriginal or non-Indigenous people and an Indigenous person, very similar issues or even sometimes significantly worse, and the justice system or the effect that has on being accountable to the perpetrator of that violence, it's significantly not in favour of Indigenous people. We talk about the gendered factors as well, gendered drivers of violence against women, talking about condoning violence against women and how men generally control decision-making and the limits to women's independence. As referred to previously, the constructions of masculinity and femininity, and the disrespect towards women and male peer relations that emphasise the aggression. So there are additional gendered drivers of violence when we're talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So we're talking about the intersection of racism and sexism, but also the impacts, again, of the colonial patriarchy when it comes to the cultures, the gender roles, men, women, and relationships, and how that sort of enmeshes outside that. Okay, so what we might do now is just to move to the actions, because obviously everybody's probably wondering what things can we do to prevent violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. Action 1, talking about healing the impacts of trauma and strengthening culture and identity. Obviously, you've heard very briefly about some of the things our community does, but also what's going on in Geraldton, which is great. There's plenty of organisations that do a lot of really community work that build that culture and identity, but we need to do more. Talking about strengthening and supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, and obviously particularly with things like removal of children and things like that, trying to build a stronger support network with what we've got and to focus on that that strengths-based work. Talking about specific initiatives for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and girls, boys and men, children and young people. Again, identified some of those specific programs that we're doing with young men, but there are obviously programs that are available to help build up capacity for our people and our community. Talking about condoning violence, challenging the condoning of violence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and again, you see that with a lot of work coming from, again, community-led grassroots approach, and increasing access to justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Addressing the legacies and ongoing impacts of colonisation. So we're talking about challenging and preventing all forms of racism, indifference, ignorance and disrespect towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and cultures. Look at all of your systems that you interact with and work every day, businesses that you use, workplaces that you're within, and, when you see something, say something, and, challenging that, you might think that it might not have much of an impact, but lots of people making lots of little reactions to this systemic racism or bias is a real positive. But also looking at the radicalised power inequalities and, like I said, challenging condoning of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait people. Talking about addressing the gendered violence, drivers of violence, So again, implementing approaches to preventing violence against women across the population. Talking about supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women's participation in leadership and decision making. That's, that to me, that's a real good one. All of these are obviously good ideas, but, women are leading the way in our communities more often than not, and challenging the gender stereotypes and the impacts of colonisation. Just got some principles for preventing violence. Sorry, I'm mindful that we're running out of time.
Take your time. Okay.
So we're talking about the principles, and we've kind of talked to them throughout the discussion and the previous discussion about self-determination, community control, and the sense of leadership. Talking about having cultural safety, so having a cultural safe organisation or workplace. Trauma-informed practice and practitioner self-care. Focus on healing and prioritising and strengthening culture. Always working from a holistic manner, making sure that you can add across all of the issues that are going on in people's life, rather than just focusing on the one thing, the violence, because recognising that everything is all, it all intersects and aligns, and you need to make sure that it's balanced in that respect. Engaging the whole community rather than just women. You've got women, men, children, young people, all of it is about healing and breaking that cycle of violence and creating safer communities for all, and working across the whole Australian community. And non-Indigenous organisations also are part of that, being allies to, building culturally safe ways to working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and communities and people. So finally, key messages. Much prevention work must be owned and led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people themselves, but recognising that drivers are deep across society, and because violence is perpetrated by men of all backgrounds, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people must not be expected to bear full responsibility for preventing this violence. We do all have a role to play, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, communities, organisations, governments at all levels, and significant work for non-Indigenous people and organisations to address racism, inequalities, the intersections of sexism and racism, and social norms and attitudes condoning violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and also policy and practice solutions that need to go hand in hand with respect to working effectively. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Brooke. I want to extend a thank you to Daphne and Monica up in the Midwest as well. Thanks to all the speakers for sharing your programs, your experiences, and your insights today. I think some of the main take-homes that I'm walking away with are there's some great campaigns and actions happening regionally across the Midwest, and so there are some opportunities for good conversation to expand those, I think, to other areas across the state. This is really a whole community approach. It's not just focused on an issue for women to challenge gender stereotypes. It's everybody that needs to work together. And some of the institutional trauma for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from the colonization, we need to understand the intersectionality of those compounding factors of violence, not just the violence itself. So some great topics for today. I want to open it up and ask a couple questions. And while I have Brooke right here, one of the questions online, what would Brooke recommend to fix the current criminal justice system? What would a functional system look like for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities? That's a big question.
That's a real big question, apart from, setting fire to the whole thing and starting again. No, just kidding. I'm reminiscent, to say that, there's things that are working well, but there's, I guess, because it's such a complex agency with Department of Justice, there are prisons all across the state. Some work better than others. Some have a high proportion, almost all Aboriginal people in some prisons, and I guess the outcome, some of those prisons are more positive. I think that having things like the treatment and the programs that we run, having significant access to programs, having better access to the programs and prisons within the community that you live and work in. Obviously, we move a lot of people off country to Perth, particularly women. Obviously, women are very disadvantaged because Bandiat Women Prison is obviously where the majority of women go, and of course detention centre. So the effects that occur there, I would like to have, look at the idea of, the old, what used to be community bail houses where people used to live and work within the community, and sort of had like the healing centres. And I think that, things like that would be far better to look at. Obviously things like having far more training and education for cultural competency and ways that we should be working better with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within the prisons, making sure that they have better access to the programs, because again, getting programs for the different issues that you need, we call them criminogenic needs, the reason that you need to stop reoffending, this, you need to do this, this, this and this, you might only get one program or you might get none, and making sure that these programs are actually available to you so that you can get the support and help that you need. But, ultimately, I think within the community, trying to promote community solutions that doesn't cause far worse consequences for that family or community by imprisoning a person. But again, recognising that, you know, in situations where safety against women and children and families is paramount, that people do need to obviously be in a prison facility, but that's not necessarily the case for every single client that I've worked with. There are some people that could easily be healed and worked with in the community, and the outcome on them and their trauma would be far better if that had been the case.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to move on to a question for Desert Blue Connect. So Monica and Daphne, are you on? Can you hear us?
Yeah, we're here.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
After developing and releasing the strategy in 2017, how have you kept your reference group involved since then?
Yes, so the reference group meets monthly, and there's 17 key agencies on that reference group. So yeah, we have a regular agenda, so they're connected that way. They also offer support. They helped us with the CRE week agreement launch. Yeah, they're just really, the momentum has increased in the last 12 months. They're very actively involved, and we still meet.
Oh, great. And have you, I know you mentioned you ran a campaign a few years back. Do you have any plans to rerun any of those campaigns or reutilize that?
Are you referring to the Champions campaign?
Yes.
Basically, we're restricted by funding. That was a short funding grant. We've still got all the materials and resources, yeah, and it would be great to reinvigorate that. We are looking to the future to see how we can actually, you know, use what we've done again, as it was really successful, and the messages of the champions were getting out there quite in the community. So in the future, but dependent on funding is the answer.
Yeah, right. And do you have any plans to expand the CRE agreement beyond Geraldton community in the Midwest?
Not at the moment. The agreement is a very basic level, level 1. We are looking at level 2 shortly, which will be a higher level. So that'll be more implementation of actions and looking at policy within workplaces. So that's our next goal, is to get the level 2 done with the current businesses, and then try and grow our current businesses in Geraldton. However, we're quite welcome for anyone to use our concepts, ideas in their community, because that's why we've developed it, to share it, and hopefully someone else can. We're welcome to all our materials to share.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I can see how those materials can and concepts be utilized into other settings. So it's great. Thank you. I have one kind of last question for everybody here. So once women leave violent relationships, they're more likely to be victims of homicide immediately after. In the immediate days, weeks after women leave a violent relationship, they're more likely to become victims. How can this be prevented, and what services and support are available for women? So open to anybody.
I can answer that from our point of view.
Sure.
Here at Desert Blue Connect, we do recognise that it's higher risk when they leave. So we would do a really rigid safety plan for that client, because the control, once they've left, the control has left that perpetrator, and it does trigger all, you know, the violence does get worse. So it's working with that woman to make sure she's safe. In the meantime, we also do a lot of education with the woman before she actually leaves, to make sure that she understands that her leaving will actually create more chance of the risk heightening. So it's around just educating, having a good safety plan, and making sure that they're really well linked into response services such as ours. We have about 4 response services that we have, and we also have a refuge that can help out. Most areas in Western Australia do have very similar response services for family violence, and my recommendation is that if, you know, a woman is thinking about leaving her partner, please wait until she gets help from an expert organisation.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Oh, well, thank you to all of our speakers today. In addition to some of the resources and topics we discussed today, the No Injury Program has a suite of resources that provide some some statistics and discussion points for violence prevention, so you can just pop onto the website for some of those. Today we ran one of our webinars. I just want to share some of the other upcoming training and events that we have here at Injury Matters. And you can just jump onto the website and register for those as well. In order to keep the conversation going from today, I think we brought up some really important and insightful conversations. So to keep that going, we have a couple of ways to network. So we offer at Injury Matters the Injury Prevention Network, which people can dial into across the state. So please contact us if you're interested in joining the network. We also have a program called Connected, in which you can sign up and you are randomly matched with another person within the group to have either a phone conversation or a quick catch up every other month. And so you can share strategies and discussion topics from your areas of expertise. And it's really to help try to break down some of those barriers from working across different settings and within different areas. So please do go on and sign up. I just want to remind you that there's an evaluation at the end of this, so if you could pop in and give some of the feedback, we'd greatly appreciate it in order to help supporting some of the, and providing topics that really keep the conversation and what you need as well. So I want to give a big thank you to Brooke, Daphne, and Monica from the Midwest, and thank you to everybody for listening online. Have a good day. Thank you.